Like, I find that most people that are very philosophically literate tend to be very politically illiterate. They think of themselves as being very smart, feels insecure that they don't know more about politics. They like being in university. They never sort of make peace with the fact that they're not in university anymore. Like, that's kind of...
Welcome back to Horseshoe Theory, the only podcast where we milk J.J. Mccullough like an aged cow. J.J.'s been hiding in our little hovel this last month to avoid execution from new Prime Minister Mark Carney, and we've been harboring him as a political prisoner. We're doing something a little different for these upcoming JJ pods. Artchad and I are taking turns tag teaming the old man for more of a one-on-one with both of us. In this episode, JJ and Artchad talk about the rise of fascism, the meaning of 20th century art, and how they both hate philosophy, and probably some other status quo gobbledygook, like how the US dollar is great and is gonna last forever and crypto's gonna crash at any moment. Sit upright, tense up, and enjoy.
You know,
that's the studio's problem. We're not right wing enough.
Is that so?
Yeah, I think if we were more right wing, the money would come. That's the big grift now.
You could probably get it's true. You could probably even get big American money, maybe, if you were a right wing grift. You know,
why? I don't understand. Is it just because because crypto is inherently, I shouldn't say inherently, but crypto is right wing. Right,
yeah,
I feel like
it's become right wing, sort of in the great sort of sorting. It's become on the right side of the ledger.
Yeah, it's things like crypto and just these get rich quick schemes that, and big tech, right? If you're pro, which big tech has become right wing.
Yeah,
like I guess I mentioned this in my new video, is that like the politics of Silicon Valley have always been really ambiguous, right? And this kind of perspective that like, oh, San Francisco and Silicon Valley and big tech was like pro-social justice and like a very progressive culture was never really true.
Yeah.
It just seems like it was like pragmatic to be so.
Yeah.
Right? But they're not actually like, except for like, I don't know, maybe like the Bill Gates or like the Klaus Schwabs, like the people who put forward like all this funding for like social justice movements or climate change or whatever, right? On the ground level, it's like the only thing that's progressive about big tech was like the comp sci grads going into the offices, right? But the actual philosophy of like the founding and the startups of all these companies, like it's not left wing at all. It was never like progressive, right? Ultimately, they're libertarian. They're anti-intervention. They don't want any government intervention. They want to do what they want to do. They want to make as much money as possible.
I think they're also just like quite broadly disinterested in anything beyond their little world.
Yeah.
Like I think when you hear some of these, tech gurus, they're all on podcasts and yapping about stuff now. And it's often like quite astonishing, like how ignorant they are, like that they just don't know very much about politics. They don't know very much how the government works. They're not really interested in anything beyond their own business and their own sort of targeted industry. And I think that in some ways makes them kind of easy marks for, I don't know, perhaps right-wing propaganda, right-wing conspiracy theories that sort of posit these very comprehensive sort of shortcuts to political knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's a big advantage that the right wing has, is that it has a lot of very sort of neat and tidy conspiracy theories that can be easily sold to a certain type of man, sort of like youngish, on the border of middle age often type, who feels insecure that they don't know more about politics. They think of themselves as being very smart. They want to get to the point where they can have sort of sweeping, confident conclusions about everything that they can lord over other people. And I just think that like a lot of right-wing sort of propaganda presents that stuff quite easily. And I think that these people were primed to be like sort of very credulous sort of swallowers of I think a sort of like a lot of right-wing sort of theories about these various conspiracies of elites that run the world, and how everything is great replacement and everything's sort of targeting the white man, and just all of this kind of stuff. Like I think that these people, just because I made a video about this a while ago where I talked about like the idea that like propaganda works best when you're kind of pushing on the open door, right?
Yeah.
Like there's no rocks of knowledge, of pre-existing knowledge. There's no foundation that prevents, sort of crazy ideas from sort of coming into your mind. And I
well, especially with how easy it is. I don't know. This sounds ignorant to say, but it seems like it's easier than ever to make a lot of money doing basically nothing.
Yeah.
Right? And then there's this like heuristic where the individual thinks, I've made money, therefore I am smart, or I've done something good. And then those types of people, right? And it's like crypto people, people who just, for all intents and purposes got lucky. Like you can't time the market. I think crypto is, it's as unknowable as like the stock market is.
Yes.
Right? then those types of people who like just believe they're inherently important because they've gotten wealthy doing something, they're the ones who fucking are gonna fall into crazy conspiracy theories. I've never met like, especially like the crypto. It's a bias because it's the people who are making social media content, but like the crypto influencers. They're all insane. They all have insane beliefs.
Yes.
I've not seen one crypto influencer who's like, yeah, I got really lucky off Bitcoin, and like other than that, I'm a social democrat. You know?
Yes.
It's always like insane beliefs about diet and government, and they have like, oh, this is the only problem in the world is this like elite, cast of people. It's insane.
Yes. No, crypto is uniquely, I think, sort of susceptible to this kind of stuff because crypto. A lot of it is like a lot of sort of like the politics and the rhetoric around crypto is just like warmed over kind of like gold bug-ism. Do you know what like it is to be a gold bug?
No.
So it's like there's always been a sort of like faction of people on sort of like the fringe of the right who believe that like the greatest injustice in the history of the United States was going off the gold standard, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah, a lot of 1971.
Yeah.
That chart where the productivity and wages split.
But a lot of times this is actually like based on like religious sort of stuff, like the idea that, gold is sort of mandated by the Bible to be man's currency. And then so with the moment we sort of like cast off gold, we've sort of fallen out of God's grace. And obviously the economy is going to collapse in this sort of context and all of that. But yeah, I mean, like, it's a very, like, this is not, like, the idea that going off the gold standard was in any way an irrational thing for the U.S. government to do. Like, that is not an argument that is taken seriously by any mainstream economist. Like, I remember there was a piece in, I forget which publication did it, but they actually, like, went around to, like, all of, like, the top economists in the U.S. and they said, does anybody disagree with the premise that it was a good thing to go off the gold standard? And no one disagrees. Everybody says, yes, that was obviously the right thing to do. And yet there's always been this fringe faction that sort of says, because our money is not tied to the tangible asset of gold, that somehow, this is the root of everything that's wrong with the economy and it's going to collapse. And, there's a looming kind of like hyperinflation and sort of economic breakdown that's just always on the brink. And, people have been selling these sort of sensationalistic books talking about the coming U.S. collapse, for centuries.
Yeah.
Or not for centuries, for decades, ever since sort of we went off the gold standard. And a lot of the Bitcoin people have basically just absorbed that exact same sort of paranoid, economically illiterate argument, but just applied it to crypto, right? So crypto sort of functions the same way gold did. It's like the US economy, the fiat currency and all this, like it's all a house of cards, it's all fundamentally unstable, it's all going to collapse any day now. The US dollar is a fake currency, blah, 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 blah. So you have to put all your money in crypto. And then this also sort of lends itself to like greater conspiracies about like, the central banks and the bankers and the, international cabal that's running the world and all that. So, I mean, and that's the thing that gets me too, is like just a lot of these conspiracy theories, even the stuff that's believed by these Silicon Valley people who think of themselves as being on the bleeding edge of the future and all that. Like a lot of their political beliefs are just incredibly old and archaic and like widely discredited, conspiracy theories from decades and decades past. And yet because they're so ignorant and sheltered, they don't realize the degree to which the things that they're saying and that they imagine to be so revolutionary and, red-pilled and, third eye opened and all this kind of stuff are just like, deeply unimpressive to anybody who actually knows about politics and history.
Do you ever get the sense that things are going to explode soon though? Do you ever feel like I don't know, maybe just because as I'm getting older, I feel like I don't have the skill set or the information to like argue those points in a significant way that'd be like meaningful to an audience. But just the more I learn about the economy, the more I feel like the more I really do get that sense of like the house of cards. Like, there's so much money. There's so much money being printed. There's so much just like made up money.
Yeah.
That just like it seems to appear out of nowhere, then backed by nothing.
Mm.
I know it's backed by the U.S. economy, right?
Yes.
But it just seems like it's so ripe for one day the whole thing to come crashing down. I don't know. Again, that just sounds like nutty, but I don't know. The more I learn about it, the more like freaked out I get about it.
Well, I mean, like I'm probably not the right person to offer a sort of like robust sort of rebuttal, because I'm not an economist, but all I can sort of say is that like people have been saying those kinds of things, like I said, for decades.
I mean, too big to fail.
Yeah, and it's just, I don't know, like the U.S. economy is incredibly resilient. Economic growth in the U.S. is a huge sort of driver of American sort of success and long-term stability. People have been betting against the U.S. economy. They've been betting against the U.S. dollar, for ages, right? And somehow the U.S. economy always manages to survive the doomsday sort of predictions. you can like it's funny. Like if you're ever bored, you can look in Amazon or eBay, type in a title like "Coming U.S. Collapse," right, and just like take a look at all the dates of publications of all of these types of books, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't definitely like when Trump got back in, I felt for this like the first time like, okay, like this seems like uniquely dire and bad, and like this feels like sort of maybe the beginning of something uniquely dark and terrible in a way that I've previously not allowed myself to be that pessimistic.
Yeah.
But I don't know, but his government has proven to be just like so incompetent and so comically inept in so many ways that I think it's just much more reasonable to bet that this is like an aberration that will be sorted out, and perhaps sorted out only after a period of pain. But like I don't think maybe like right after his election, I'm like, okay, maybe we'll move the doomsday clock, minute hand a little bit closer to midnight. But now I feel like I'm inclined to think like, after this first 100 days as we film this,
I hate that doomsday clock. I'd go in there and I'd put it all the way back, and then the scientists would walk in and be like, oh, things are fine. Wait, no, sorry guys. Yeah, the doomsday clock reset. We're all good now.
I saw it actually in person.
You saw the doomsday
clock?
Yeah,
I went to visit, my friend is a professor at the University of Chicago, and I went there to see it in person. And it's just this small little crappy plastic thing. It's
yeah. I don't know. That's where I have a reverence for authority and academic authority, and then I hear shit like that, and I'm like, do these people fucking know anything? The doomsday clock. I have to trust these random scientists to be like, well, yes, it's moved 10 seconds closer this year.
Well, when you like look at like the list of occasions in which they've moved the minute hand closer to midnight, like it's all just like completely like forgotten random events. It's like, oh, North Korea like fired a missile once in like 2002 or something. Okay, well, we're closer to doomsday now. Or like, tensions, in India, Pakistan, or just like all sorts of just like random things that are like long forgotten now. We just keep, because they'll take any occasion to move it closer, because
that's all they do.
Yeah,
there's their whole meaning in life. They do the clock closer.
They do a press conference. They get some media attention. It creates easy sort of clickbait headlines. Bada bing, bada boom. The UFC gets more attention, so they're happy. So
Yeah, that's what I mean, man. I don't know the Trump. I've come around to, I think, your perspective as well, because I felt the same way, and I felt like there was a point where the things I was writing and the stuff I was making, I couldn't think about anything else besides Trump.
Yeah.
And the implications of the second Trump presidency, but it is just proving, I don't know, every day more and more just shows to be like goofy.
Yeah.
Like it's a much more goofy administration than I think people thought it would be. Like it's very goofy. The fucking like the AI generated Pope picture.
Yeah.
Right, and it's like you're like, oh, this is so. It's so bad. It's funny. In a way, and it's just constant. It's the flood the zone with shit.
Yeah,
the Steve Bannon, MO, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's just like, because at the core, like, Trump is himself just such a preposterous figure.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they posted this other, like, for the May the 4th, where, like, him as, like, a Jedi Knight or something. But it's just, like, you look at it and you're just, like, aware that that's just not who Trump is. Like, Trump is not an imposing, threatening, like, he's not even, like, a frightening figure, except in the sense that he's, like, frighteningly incompetent, right? But he's not, like, an intimidating presence who's like so masculine and like fierce and intense, and that we're sort of like awed by his competence and like his masculine virile energy. And so like when they post this kind of stuff, or when you sort of see these people that are sort of sycophants, at his cabinet meetings, and it's like, oh, Mr. President, you're the greatest man who ever lived, and that kind of stuff. Like the goofiness, as you said, is just sort of too obvious to deny, and that's dangerous, right? Because they're operating on the premise that Trump is like, in some level, like a sort of scary figure, that he's like going to like intimidate the left and everybody else into sort of submission. But if instead, like increasingly, he becomes a figure of scorn and mockery, right? That whole sort of premise of that sort of theory of the case of the second term starts to break down, and then, his numbers decrease, and people just don't care. Like people just are not intimidated. They laugh, they mock, and and then they become ready to move on, right?
See how this, I don't know, groks for you, because just coming to mind here. I do think like a silver lining, because I've seen a competency in left-wing alternative media in the past year that I've never seen before, right? Where like it seems like the big left-wing, and not just alternate media, but mostly, right? The big left-wing thinkers are talking about things that seem quite dire and serious.
Yeah.
Right? Like talking about like the end of like democracy,
Yeah.
the rise of authoritarianism, how fascism works, like these very fundamental like ideas and how to protect the institutions we've built.
Yes.
And I don't think they would have gotten there because maybe I was in like the wrong bubble, right, when I was younger, but it seemed like all left-wing media would talk about was like culture war things.
Yeah.
And I never really, like, some of it's important and some of it gets like, written off too easy. But to me, that's a non-issue compared to like the other looming threats. Like the culture war stuff, like whatever there is to solve there comes second to like protecting and insulating like the institutions that the West has.
Yeah.
That seem to be, more precarious now.
Yeah.
But I don't think they would have gotten there without someone so obviously authoritarian.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's like a good thing that like Trump got in,
Yeah.
obviously. But it is a silver lining that his rhetoric has pushed left-wing thinkers to be like, okay, fuck, how do we protect social democracy?
Yeah.
I
hope that's the case. Like, I hope that because I guess there's like sort of two conclusions that you can draw if you're sort of the left in that way, particularly if you're kind of like far left type of person. You can sort of pause and you can sort of say, maybe these institutions of, bourgeois democracy that I was so dismissive of, maybe they matter a great deal. And thus we have an interest in sort of strengthening, the powers of Congress and checks and balances and, a free press and sort of legacy media and all these kinds of things. Or I suppose as well, you can kind of conclude that, that these institutions have fundamentally failed, and thus on some level they're kind of like fundamentally useless, and we sort of have to be planning for a future that goes beyond those sort of things. Mm-hmm. And so like there's no point to strengthen them because they've already failed their most important test. We sort of need to be thinking beyond that. And that sort of second style of thinking is one that I don't personally have a lot of time for. I think that we're in a moment, or sort of the Americans are in a moment where the necessity of sort of strengthening the institutions of sort of post-war liberalism seem very self-evident to me.
Yeah.
And that I think that we should have respect for, the kind of the traditional American way of doing liberal democracy, which includes, like I said, sort of checks and balances, due process, a free press, and sort of clearly identify the degree to which the Trump administration is going to war with those kinds of things. But, like a lot of left-wing types, like far left types, I think don't want to kind of have that conversation because that feels, I don't know, insufficiently sort of revolutionary maybe in spirit.
Yeah, they're conceding their like ideological basis a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like the opposite of the classic, the guy standing in the center, and there's like the guy standing on the right, the guy standing on the left,
Yeah.
and the guy on the left moves farther left, and then calls the guy on the right like a Nazi, but the guy on the right hasn't moved. It's the reverse.
Yeah.
Right? Where you have like the right moves farther and farther and farther.
Yes.
And then you have like the left by turn like gets more moderate almost,
Yes.
where it's like
Yes.
there's a far more consensus on the left of like, okay, what is actually important? What do we believe in? What are we trying to protect? What are we conserving?
Yes. It becomes a sort of broader coalition because it's true. Because as the right wing moves further and further to the right, they shed people along the way.
Yeah.
Right. Sort of moderate sort of Republicans and conservatives and that sort of start to identify, not necessarily with a left per se, but just kind of like the broad coalition that is opposed to this far right sort of enterprise.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that you're seeing a bit more, even from, I think some people that perhaps previously thought of themselves as being far left, is that they're realizing the importance of coalition building and a coalition-based politics as opposed to the politics of sort of purity, right? Which is, the only way that I think authoritarianism, sort of extremism, has ever been effectively resisted has been through the building of broad movements that include, people of diverse array of backgrounds on, certain issues. But if you can all sort of focus on what is the big fundamental problem that has to be addressed, which is, sort of an authoritarian government that's sort of seeking to, strip away the rights of the individual, I think that should hopefully be a mobilizing thing. And that's why, for example, in America, you have, like say like Bernie and AOC are like giving these big sort of speeches that are delivering big rallies and all that kind of stuff. And I've seen like a lot of the kind of people that I consume, sort of like moderate people or sort of like former Republicans that have turned never Trump Republicans.
Yep.
Like they're at peace with that. Like they don't have a problem being part of a movement that say includes, Bernie Sanders and AOC as people that play a role in sort of helping mobilize people in opposition to Trump. But in return, some of these far left people are sort of having to concede that, yes, actually, Trump is uniquely bad. Trump and Kamala Harris are not, in fact, just interchangeable two sides of the same coin in the way that I think a lot of far left rhetoric previously likes to say.
Yeah.
Right? So you kind of have this just like people kind of getting more on the same page as to what the stakes of the political moment are, and then you use different people's political talents in the direction of fighting this common enemy rather than fighting very particular narrow ideological ones.
And then inversely as well, sorry, not inversely, but just like you see the same thing that was happening. Everyone said like, the left eating itself, the left is fragmented, the left, like you never be woke enough. All the rhetoric from the late 2010s,
Yes.
you can now increasingly apply to the right.
Yes.
Right? Where the right is becoming fragmented, where you have these like anti-democracy, like NRX tech people, you have Christian nationalists, you have conspiracy theorists, and they're all sort of, you know, infighting increasingly, right? Where you have like Elon Musk, I mean, it was like overdone story, but like Elon Musk supporting the HV1 visas.
Yeah.
And then there was the meme where it's like, it was like a guy with a mega hat, like a Wojak, and he was like, "Wait, I thought we were building an ethno state."
Yeah.
Then Elon Musk is like, "Dig the fucking hole," you know?
Yeah.
Right. It was what we're seeing increasingly. This fragmenting on the right.
Yeah, even fragmenting, like, yeah, literally, like within the Trump administration itself. Like Elon has also been very outspoken in his opposition to tariffs, right? Which seems to be a very divisive issue within the administration, and yeah, people are sort of coming at that, and. Yeah, and a lot of people like didn't think that this was a government that was going to be all about tariffs to the extent it has been. So, no, it's true. It's like it's very much held together through like Trump himself, like a deference to Trump's leadership, and the fact that like no one is allowed to criticize Trump sort of makes Trump kind of like the ultimate sort of King Solomon figure who decides, you know, he moderates the disputes between these different sort of factions of his base and even within his administration. But then you think, like, once that kind of figurehead goes away, once, you know, sort of the reverent God King that everybody has agreed to sort of outsource their thinking to vanishes, you know, then what happens? Then I do think you would get sort of the return to the kind of factionalism.
Yeah. And the degree, too, that, you know, I believe that, you know, 2 years ago, if you had asked anybody who was like, you know, anybody besides like mainstream media, is Joe Biden too old?
Yeah.
They would have said yes.
Yeah.
That wasn't like a controversial thing to say. As much as the right tried to pin it, like it was this big conspiracy theory of Biden has dementia, but no one wants to talk about it. Like, no, everybody talked about it except for like CNN, right?
Yeah.
Except for the most like center-left mainstream media. But no one will talk about that on the right with Trump. Because Trump is clearly, like, he can't finish sentences.
Yeah.
And you can't deny that. You can't deny, like, when he does like a press conference, any speech he gives, he starts... It's not the weave that they say, right?
Yeah.
He starts 9 fucking stories.
Yes.
He's like, I was going to this place, but then that guy was a great man.
Yeah.
And everyone knew I was the biggest guy in New York. But then when I was like, he just he can't finish a sentence. He can't finish a story because he's fucking, what is he, 81?
Yeah.
Or 80?
Oh, he's 1946, so
79.
Yeah.
Right? Clearly, there's no denying that.
Yeah.
But they can't. No one will face that fact on the right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think there's been a lot of sort of good writing about this because in the last, we just recently celebrated or honored or recognized his 100 days in office. And he did a number of interviews. He did an interview with, I believe, with Time Magazine. He did one with The Atlantic. And there's been some good reviews of those interviews because they focused on just how incoherent he is.
Yeah.
Like, even when he's asked about, like, his supposedly, like, best issues, the issues that he cares the most about, like immigration or tariffs, he can't even, like, defend his own policies in anything resembling a sort of coherent manner, right? And so it is, like, it's becoming undeniable. Like, it's becoming undeniable that this man has a sort of pudding brain, and that it's like, it should be, like, headline news in the way that the Biden thing was, right?
Yeah.
Because, and the Biden thing, like, in my argument, or in my, I would posit, that as bad as Biden got, a lot of it was his ability to sort of communicate sort of effectively. Whereas with Trump, it's the inability to communicate effectively, and also just like an abundance of evidence suggesting that he just doesn't know anything about government or anything about the economy or anything about even his own policies, right? Like when they ask him about the Diego Garcia thing, the guy that was, deported to El Salvador.
This is the hairdresser?
No, this was the other guy.
The
guy
autism tattoo guy.
The guy from, no, this was a different guy. This was the guy from the
guy who got turned at the border. No, a different guy.
The Maryland guy.
Yeah.
The Maryland dad. The guy who had the tattoos on his fingers, supposedly, right?
Oh, yeah, because there's the interview where they had photoshopped MS-13, and then he was like, it said MS-13, and then the guy's like, it didn't. He's like, can you just say it did?
Yeah, that was another interview in which Trump really seems, as the Irish would say, is with the fairies. But But the thing is, like when Trump's been asked about the deportation of this guy, like these interviewers sort of say, like, well, you know, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that you have to make an effort to bring him back to the U.S. And Trump is just like confused and just says, well, you know, my lawyers say no, or like I've been told otherwise, right? Like it's just like he's not plugged into the decisions that are being made in his own administration, which makes him seem like, you know, a bit of a sort of hapless puppet. And then again, in that context, when we can see with our eyes that he is this kind of like pudding-brained puppet. And then at the same time, like the White House, you know, social media accounts are like showing these images of him as this virile, you know, macho guy, you know, the Pope or the Jedi Knight and that kind of stuff. Like it starts to just become pathetic. Like it's not. And then as a result, the people that are playing defense for this, all of these right-wing sort of commentators and you know, pundits and influencers, they look pathetic in the sense that they're defending this sort of preposterous government, right? And that's why I think it is just so important that people that are critical of this, you know, just really demand accountability from the right-wing influencer set, because they always want to change the topic, they always want to talk about other things, but just like they should really be made to account for this ridiculous man that they have deemed fit to be president of the United States for another 3 years.
Yeah.
Right?
My fear is that, because I critique the right for this so much, as someone who was in this camp when I was younger, of building this imaginary like left-wing figure and then fighting against that, right? Yeah. Where it's like the Charlie Kirks or the Dave Rubins.
Yeah.
They imagine there is just this evil demon, like blue-haired, non-binary, who wants your kids to get gender reassignment surgery, and that's like their war. Yes. But that doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. I think it did exist. It existed on university campuses. Like when I was in university, I felt like I was a fucking crazy person.
Yeah.
For like having very, orthodox opinions. But it doesn't exist anymore. No one's fighting that war. There's no major influential left-wing thinker who is speaking like that now, right? And what the left is doing now is building the same thing on the right. They're building this like delusional conspiracy theorist, credulous individual who is sort of the same thing that the right built on the left, right? They're building this imaginary figure, then fighting against that.
Yeah.
But I think it's important, like, you said this one time with the right, how you were worried, like, once they felt like they won their war, they wouldn't be able to progress past it, right? Which is kind of proving to be true. They can't progress past, like, their old battles.
Yeah.
And I feel like the left will end up in the same... This is sort of the great cycle. The left will end up in the same position. There's going to be a future, 10 years from now, where I do think that all these talks like authoritarianism or like how bad Trump is, the war will be won. Like we'll go back to more moderate, and then the left will never give it up. The left will always talk about this period in history where like, oh, we almost lost democracy.
Yeah.
And they'll do it for 10 years later, 20 years later, and they'll never like be able to move past it.
And that will turn people off.
Yeah, and then the pendulum swings back rightwards, right?
Yeah, because it'll be sort of like, I could see what you're saying. So it's sort of like the left's rhetoric will not sort of adapt to the sort of the changing circumstances of the time in the same way that the right's has, or in the same way that the No, that makes a good point. The one thing that I've always sort of noticed, and I think is a sort of curious sort of fact of life in American politics, it's actually quite different than how it is in Canada, is just the degree that like the Democratic Party is held politically accountable for things that just the most random ass like social media people do.
Yeah.
Right? And versus that the Republican Party is often not held accountable for things that Trump himself says and does, right? Like there was a tweet that I saw a while ago that I thought was very clever, where it's sort of like, the Democratic Party is held accountable for what like a viral Australian skincare TikTok ad, posits or displays, whereas the Republican Party is not held accountable for things that are explicitly in like the Republican Party platform.
Yeah.
Right? So like somebody will share like some, like libs of TikTok viral video and be like, this is why I'm supporting Trump, right? It's like, is this just some random person from whatever, positing their sort of theory of the case? And like, it's bizarre to me that that's kind of like how politics could operate. And that, I suppose that really sort of shows that like politics is becoming ultimately just a matter of expressing opinion on a sort of like broad cultural vibe that you kind of pick up.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, oh, like the left, I don't like their vibe. I don't like things that I see people on social media that I consider sort of left aligned to be doing. And therefore I'm going to vote for this party and not the other party. even though like the parties exist independently of vibes. They exist independently of these sort of just broad kind of like cultural trends. And I think that's just, I don't know, like there's something about that strikes me as just like deeply, deeply unserious, deeply decadent.
Yeah.
You know, that we're just practicing politics as this like weird form of like cultural grievance and cultural self-expression, as opposed to actually like understanding politics as a matter of like politicians offering propositions and policy prescriptions and then sort of voting to the degree you prefer or don't like those things.
It's all they have, man. It's like Charlie Kirk is still on campus at Columbia arguing with 18-year-olds.
Yeah.
It's all he has.
Yeah.
It's all he has. Like, it's pathetic. I saw like a clip the other day. It's just like viral clips on Twitter of like, it's like, what is a woman? And she's like, anyone that identifies as a woman. And then, like, you know, he like, oh, you can't do a circular argument, you fucking idiot. And then like, you know.
But it's like, this is like not where the politics of the real world are.
Exactly.
Right? It's like when you look at like Congress, it's not like the only thing that Congress ever debates is like, what is a woman? It's like the what is a woman bill of 2025. Like everybody must spend time sort of debating this. Like, no, these are like very sort of like side issues. Like, you know, the young people, and it's problematic because it's like, you know, the young people are not literate in economic matters. They don't understand what tariffs are. They don't know what good trade policy should look like. They're just completely disconnected from the actual real world things that are consuming the attention of Congress and the White House and all the rest of it. And instead they're just like, yeah, for the 7,000th time, we're debating like, what does it mean to be a woman? What are pronouns? You know, like what is DEI? And just like all this kind of stuff that the actual political process has so far removed from, or has so far progressed beyond, if it was ever that fixated on it in the first place. And I think that's an important question to ask as well, is because I think you're right to sort of say like there was a cultural moment in which these kinds of debates were burning much brighter than they are now. But I don't know, like, were they ever the forefront of the political process? I don't think so. Maybe they were a little bit in this country, but the idea that, like, you know, there was ever a time in the US where this kind of stuff was like the driving, animating purpose of the Democratic Party, as opposed to, you know, stuff relating to, you know, government regulation of economic things or taxes or, you know, stuff like that.
No, it's like when Trump, you know, cut off funding to Maine.
Yeah.
Over the with this?
Yeah.
The transgender athletes.
Yeah.
There's two.
Yeah.
There's two transgender athletes in the entire high school system in Maine, right? And it's like that's what the war is being fought over.
Yeah.
I see like I'm very bullish on like the alternative media left, and I grow increasingly so because there seems to be this like rising archetype of person who is like, especially with men. I think men need it the most. Men need like these strong figures to sort of define like what it means to be like a rational, responsible person.
Mm.
And I see this growing arc. I think the soy pill is a great example.
Oh yeah, he's great.
Yeah. Of this, like, I am like responsible. I am like a driven, ambitious man. I take care of myself. I'm like traditionally masculine. Here is what like that type of person believes in. Like if you have self-respect, if you are independent, if you're logical, if you're rational, this is like the proper way to go about and like view the world. Whereas like you should question, like you can't just go blindly right wing because it feels like the most masculine thing to do.
Yes.
You can't go blindly like might makes right.
Yes.
I'm a strong man. I'm like argue over anybody because it feels like the right thing to do. You have to go about it like first principles and like very pluralistic on like what is the best for the world.
Yeah.
What is my responsibility as like a political thinker to spread amongst the world to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And I see people increasingly building that case, right? Like I don't know. I guess like the left wing Joe Rogan archetype that everyone wants so desperately, but that's what it is. I think men need that, and I see that growing. I don't think it's no longer an issue.
I think if I was sort of to be gender reductive about this, I also think that in some ways, you know, like men are interested in real world things, real world problems, like looking at what's in the headlines, who are these sorts of characters that we're being, you know, told to focus on, and what are they doing in the government and whatnot. And, you know, Soy Pill, I think, has made good videos in that regard as well, is that he's like demanding accountability from the people that actually exist in the real world of politics. He made a very good video about Elon the other day, just like kind of like deconstructing his record and all of that, as opposed to, I think, some of these more kind of like highfalutin sort of theoretical, philosophical kind of rambles that I think a lot of left-wing influencers have historically been more interested in. And I actually think that was one of the great sort of failings of the kind of the left-wing intelligentsia during the first Trump administration, is that they weren't really engaged with the government itself, you know, because I think that they had a sort of posture where they were sort of above, above sort of petty, you know, politics and, you know, the kinds of things that you read about in the newspapers. They want to talk about the big questions of like, what is true democracy? What is true justice? You know, what is, you know, equality and all of that. And I think that in some ways those kinds of high concept discussions are a luxury that you can have in good times. And so I like the sort of the rise. I hope we see the rise of a kind of like left-wing influencer class who are fixated on the actual problems and public policy that's actually manifesting in the real world.
Yeah, I see it. Even like,
so.
I listen to a lot of Kyle Kalinske.
Yeah,
he's so angry and depressing that I like have to shut him off all the time.
Is that so? I like David Pakman. I think David Pakman is quite good. Have you watched any of him?
No. Oh wait, no, yeah, I have. I've watched David Pakman.
He can be a bit of an acquired taste because he's very dry, right? Like he has this very like dry manner of speaking. But he has a very like wry sense of humor that I think really kind of grows on you. But it's the same thing. Like Kyle and David, like they're good because they're always consistently engaging with the headlines of the moment, right? They're talking about things that are happening day to day. They're reacting to actual news events, actual political decisions, policy consequences, and that. And I think that's good because I think that's what it is to be engaged in politics. Like, you know, we can all sort of have our first principles conversations now and then, but at the same time, like, if you ask me, it's like your true values are communicated by the degree that you're kind of literate enough to engage with real world political problems and the degree to which you're able to have a kind of like instinctive, you know, thoughtful reaction to things that are happening, being able to like quickly adjudicate, this is right, this is wrong, this should happen, this should not happen, this decision is bad because of, you know, X, Y, and Z. And I think that, yeah, some of these sort of like YouTube types, I guess you could sort of say like these like channels that are engaged with the news as opposed to, you know, the vaunted, what do they call it? The video essay kind of crowd. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's fun. Philosophy's fun, but it's just fun. You know what I mean?
It's a luxury, I think. Have you ever heard the term like luxury beliefs?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like a lot of like video essay philosophy stuff is very much the embodiment of that. And I think that it can also sort of like, you know, frankly, in my opinion, a lot of that kind of stuff kind of masks a level of ignorance and a level of insecurity about an inability to engage with real world politics.
Yeah, 100%. People, you know, for how much people, you know, hark on appealing to authority, it's just as much an appeal to authority to say you believe everything that like Anthony Fauci says as it is to, you know, only quote like continental philosophers in your explanation of like American society.
Yeah.
To be like, oh, well, Baudrillard would say this.
Yeah, yeah.
And Deleuze would say this.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, it's still an appeal to authority. Like, what the fuck does that guy know?
Yeah.
Like, it's interesting, right? Like, I think there's plenty of value in reading those types of books, but to build your worldview off of, you know, and increasingly, maybe not increasingly, but just like this. I'm against this so much because this is like what I was against in my university degree. It's just like Adorno, Deleuze, Habermas, you know, these like postmodern, late modern continental philosophers who, for some reason, we have universities and university students, maybe less so now, but like my generation, picked this like part of the world and this section of time and thought, all these people have the best takes.
Yes.
And
yes,
I'm going to build my entire political philosophy and worldview and my view on culture and my principles off of like this sect of authors.
Yes.
And it just makes, I don't know, we're getting past it now, but it makes no sense.
Yeah.
It's still an appeal to authority, and it still just proves you can't deduce anything. You can't come up with your own original opinions. You can't like draw conclusions out of like a broad set of information.
Yeah. And I think in some ways, you know, these kids, they basically just, they like being in university. They never sort of make peace with the fact that they're not in university anymore. Like that's kind of, you know, their sort of safe space,
yeah,
to use a sort of cliche term.
I feel it 100%.
Yeah. You feel that longing, that desire to still be in that space?
Yeah, because it's like, you know, that's where you develop your position on the social hierarchy.
Yeah. That's
where you develop your value add to the world and part of your identity and your ego. And then you continue to make, like, you know, you read, it's the same thing with like Derrida, right? By the end of like Derrida's career, he was just his writing was so esoteric and so like incomprehensible to anybody but his colleagues.
Yes.
Right? But that's his dick measuring contest.
Yeah.
And as a man too, right? That's where you're like, you feel at the top of your game. And then you leave university, you no longer have that. Like, all these authors that, I don't know, to me seem like ubiquitous. You know, if I make a video and I bring up like Mark Fisher, to me that feels like a tired trope because that's like the world I've developed in. But to anybody else, who the fuck knows who Mark Fisher is? You know? Like this podcast audience does, but like my fucking mom doesn't.
Yeah.
You know? He's just some random... How many sales does capitalist realism have, do you think? Like 80,000? Right? Like nothing crazy. How many sales does capitalism schizophrenia have? Like Yield and Deleuze?
Yeah.
It's not that many.
No, I remember, like, I don't know, like, sometimes you feel like people are just programmed in different ways, right? And, like, some people are just drawn to things that I'm just so deeply sort of indifferent to. And I feel like a lot of this kind of, like, high philosophy, postmodern philosophy just is that for me. I remember when I was in university, I would write papers, and my professors would sometimes, like, mark me down, and they'd say, like, this reads too much like, you know, a column in the newspaper, like an opinion column, right? It's like you're not like writing like in an academic tone. Like you're good at writing, but you're writing in sort of like the wrong way. And it's because like I would always want to bring it back to like, well, real world politics. Like, you know, how does this apply in the world we inhabit as opposed to just purely apply in this world of abstractions where the only examples you bring up are like the most kind of like, you know, sort of platonic kind of like, well, the idea of a prison presumes that, you know, like this kind of thing, right?
JJ, I didn't see one made-up adjective in this paper. Are you sure you're reading the material? I didn't see you say super hyper positional once, you know?
And it's like, I guess it's fine to an extent. Like, anybody can enjoy whatever they do. But I guess just like as someone like me who does care a lot about politics and takes politics seriously, I do resent on some level the idea that just engaging in this kind of like high-minded, you know, postmodern philosophy, discourse, you know, abstraction stuff is what being political is.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a kind of bad example, especially when like the stakes are high. Like I think it's bad that sort of a generation of young people are thinking that just, you know, reading Mark Fisher and talking about like his abstractions is what it means to be a politically engaged person.
Yeah.
Right?
It's fun and it's neat. And I think like that's the concession I've made with that type of literature is that it's like some people read fiction.
Yes.
Some people go to the bookstore and they buy the next Stephen King novel and it's fun. I read, you know, Byung-Chul Han.
Yes.
And maybe I get like a tidbit of like, oh, this is an interesting way to look at the world. But it's not concrete. It's not set in stone. It's not scripture. And that's the best way to look at it, right? Like my videos are fun. I love like I bring this stuff up in my videos when I talk about art and things like that. But it's neat.
Yes.
I'm not like it's not a supplementation of like real political thought and like knowledge on like policy. You know, so I think it's the best way to look at it. But yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I have my gripes with it, but
yeah, it's just. I mean, it is interesting that it still remains so resonant with so many people, because again, like I just felt like it just seemed very self-evidently kind of like meaningless or like a bit of a sort of like decadent kind of luxury. But I don't know, maybe it is sort of scratches the same itch that fiction does for some people.
Yeah, it's lore. It's lore.
It's lore.
It's 100% lore. Like who the fuck has read Deleuze for any other reason but to say they've read Deleuze and to discuss Deleuze with people?
Yeah.
Right? It's fun. It's neat. Yeah. You build a community around it.
Yeah, no, it's the same.
You talk
with, like,
online
with like, and in some ways, like, yeah, it becomes like a badge of honor. Like Hegel, right? Like, you know, famously, like very impenetrable, difficult to comprehend.
Bad writer.
But, yeah, exactly. But it becomes as, you know, and I think Baudrillard as well, who I sort of have more time for. I made a video about Baudrillardian, you know, sort of his iconic theory. But at the same time, like it's very impenetrable. It's very difficult to understand because it's a different type of writing. And so as a result, it becomes a bit of a badge of honor that you can like wade through this kind of stuff. You can grapple with it. I did a video about this as well, where I talked about, you know, basically like this sort of three kind of like theories of like knowledge, right? Like there's fact-based knowledge, skill-based knowledge, and ideas-based knowledge. And when you sort of get into the subculture of people that are into the idea of like ideas-based knowledge, they're often very proud at how difficult the stuff that they engage with is, you know, like, was it Marcus Aurelius and all of this kind of stuff, right? It's like, well, you really kind of like have to like read it and reread it and like wrestle with it and like, you know, mark up your book with a million highlights and sticky notes and that kind of stuff. Like to them, that's part of the fun.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess that can be fun. I'm not going to yuck anyone's yum, as they say. But at the same time, it's just to mischaracterize that as being what it is to be political, I think is somewhat is problematic.
It gets, you know, Josh Citarella has so many he's this great kind of theory about like LARPing.
Yeah.
And I mean, and this does get into like Baudrillardian sort of like simulation, right?
Yes.
Of like you're not doing anything authentically. You are like recreating a moment in time you thought existed, right? So like you get this, which is very sexy to me personally. Like, you know, going to a bar and like getting a few drinks and discussing the big ideas for 8 hours in this like, you know, this rebellious revolutionary community of academics you've built in the city, you know, like that's super sexy. That's great. But ultimately that's all you're doing is like, it's the same as going to a fucking Renaissance fair, I think. 100%.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just, you know, a lot of my sort of political understanding and sense of political identity has been based around like Canada and questions of Canada and like Canadian identity, Canadian politics and all that. Like a very specific topic. Right?
Yeah.
And to me, it's just like, I always just want to apply anything that I've learned to the Canadian context, right? Like I want to try to apply sort of theories to Canada. And I kind of feel like if you can't apply your theory to Canada specifically, I want to see it done. And if you can't do it, if you're not intellectually equipped to do it, like I don't have a lot of time for you, right? Like that's basically always kind of been and I suppose like the thing that I realized a lot growing up in this country is that I see people that have these very like high-minded sort of philosophical ideals that they purport to believe in, and yet politically in sort of the day-to-day sort of sense, you know, they'll support political parties whose positions are wildly at odds with those things that they purport to believe, right? And so I don't know, like to me, that's very disillusioning, right? And it sort of suggests to me that these beliefs that they present as being, you know, sort of core to their identity, they're perfectly willing to kind of like sacrifice when it comes to entering a realm that is in fact not contiguous with this realm of philosophy, if that makes sense, right? So it's like they have like their philosophical political beliefs, you know, so-called, but then when you see like what their real world political behavior is, it's completely detached from that. So in that sort of sense, like they can believe in these kind of like postmodern beliefs, oh, you know, there should be no state and I'm a socialist anarchist or whatever. But then, you know, at the same time, when they're in the political realm, you know, they'll vote for a party that, you know, is very statist and believes in, you know, a large role for government and managing the economy and so on and so forth, right?
It's all part of the plan, JJ.
Is that so?
Yeah, it's all part of the plan.
Is that so?
It's just a means to an end. It's always a means to an end.
I don't know.
Yeah.
The easier explanation, I guess, is just that, you know, they know a lot about one realm of knowledge and they don't know as much about a different realm of knowledge, and that they kind of have an inability to kind of like make any sort of connective tissue between the two. I find that just to be broadly the case. Like I find that most people that are very philosophically literate tend to be very politically illiterate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I think I keep forgetting my point. Oh yeah, because you mentioned I think my generation I've come to describe as flaky.
Flaky?
We're flaky people.
Okay.
Right? We can't hold relationships down. We're always looking for the next best thing. We can't settle down. And we do that ideologically as well, where you just said, you know, you frame everything, you know a lot about Canada.
Yeah.
Right? That's your specialty, your expertise.
Yeah.
You've spent your lifetime basically building this canon of knowledge on
Yeah.
Canada. My generation doesn't want to do that.
Yeah.
We don't want to have, like, we can't face the fact that, like, okay, to be genuinely intelligent and well-read and an expert on something, you have to spend, like, most of your time focusing on one topic, right? You can't, if you want to be an expert in the American political system, you can't go into, like, postmodern theory. Like, that door closes, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same with like with STEM majors, right? With any other academic practice that's like really material. You focus on, like, if you're a biologist, you know, you can spend your entire career studying one bug.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's not very sexy. It's not very exciting. You can't build grand narratives about reality by studying one thing.
Yes.
And I don't know, we don't want to concede the fact that it's like, you know, at some point in my intellectual carear, I have to close the doors on, you know, whatever it is and focus on one thing if I want to be like someone that can, you know, present knowledge to people.
It is terrifying, and in some ways, though, that's one of the difficult lessons of growing up and becoming mature, is realizing like all the things that you cannot be and all the things you will not do. You know, like the idea, like at some point you're not going to be an astronaut or an actor or a basketball player or whatever. You are going to be this kind of thing, and you know, part of maturity is having the confidence to say that's fine, like that's good enough. And so that's a good insight, to the degree to which a lot of sort of young people are, if they seem a little scattered, it's because they're in some ways sort of like terrified of making a hard commitment.
Yeah, which I feel like I'm at with my YouTube channel, because I've been all over the place, but I just grow, you know, increasingly okay with the fact that I'm just going to focus on probably like 20th century art
Yeah.
And that's going to be like the set of knowledge that is the basis of my channel. But it's exciting though, because like I can become the kind of person that like is a good communicator, a good educator, a good podcast guest, someone who's like, oh, this guy's on, like this guy's like a really, really knows a lot about this one thing.
Yes.
And I have a value add. It's not just like, I feel, as a young person, I feel more listless and meaningless when it's like, I do have this wide set of knowledge, but it's all so surface level. It's very schizo, like horizontal, where I know a little bit about a lot of things.
Yes.
And then when it comes down to communicating and educating,
yes,
I can't.
Yes.
Like I have that whole thing about, like you said, everyone has one thing they want to say and they just keep repeating it.
Yes.
You just become that type of person. Instead of, being able to get really deep into something where people are genuinely excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, it's just so much more attractive because we suffer from this delusion that unless we know everything about everything, like no one will take us seriously, no one will respect us. But I think in many ways people respect you less if you just seem like you have just very superficial or shallow or ignorant kind of takes. Like we all know the person that's kind of like, they used to call this like the Reader's Digest genius, like the person who has these like overly confident takes about a vast array of topics that he clearly barely understands, right? And that is very off-putting, as opposed to somebody who is modest and open about the things that he doesn't have a lot of knowledge of, but then is confident and is clearly well-read and educated in the things he does know a lot of stuff about. The challenge is just like knowing what realm is worth sort of fixating on and is worth sort of becoming a sort of fully fledged, well-read, hyper-literate person on. I was just very critical of people that have chosen to do that with philosophy. So, I mean, I suppose maybe there is a bit of a value judgment that's there in the sense that some people will judge you very harshly if you put all of your chips on the wrong bet. But I think 20th century art is a pretty good one as far as knowledge that is culturally relevant and useful. And let me ask you a question, Brogan. Let me ask you a high-minded question about this.
Okay.
What do you think is the fundamental story of 20th century art?
I think the fundamental story is 20th century art comes from, it's like one of the splinters of thought that make up modernism, where before I would start at like after the French Revolution, right? Before then, all art and basically everything was in service to like a meta narrative.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's the postmodern versus modernist argument, right? Everything was in service to a meta narrative, to like hierarchy, to religion. And then once that split happens, right? You have all of a sudden like ethics can be for its own sake.
Yeah.
And philosophy can be for its own sake. And political science can be for its own sake. Everything splits off into like these different ideals that becomes modernism. And 20th century art is the story of art becoming idiosyncratic.
Yes.
And art becoming like in service to itself for its own sake, and then what develops from that. And then that dies though. That dies around the 80s for me. Right? I really think that's where that story ends, maybe with Basquiat's a great example of like the bookend of 20th century modern art.
Yeah.
Because Basquiat was somebody who like was talented, was an interesting artist, but ultimately was fabricated by Andy Warhol.
Yeah.
Like Andy Warhol, his career is dying, he's old, he's like losing relevance. He finds this kid on the street in New York who's doing graffiti, and he's like, I'm gonna make you famous.
Yes.
You kid, you're gonna be a big shot.
Yes.
And you're gonna do it with me.
Yes.
So he brings Basquiat up into the high art world. And Basquiat died at 27.
Yeah.
Right? So at this point, he's like 23, 24. Makes him a famous artist. Makes him the hottest artist in New York. In service to his own career. And the whole thing is fabricated to bolster Andy Warhol and to like produce a lot of money. Then Basquiat dies. And that's like the perfect example of the end of modern art, where it starts to become, it's no longer like, I would say, abstract expressionism like Jackson Pollock. That's real. That's like someone exploring ideas for the sake of exploring their own ideas in the canon of modern art. So like with Rothko, Philip Guston, you can move into the 70s, right? And then Basquiat isn't that. Basquiat is in service to like capital, is in service to fame, to clout, to what we associate art with now, which is like, it's all very well funded. It's all very like academic, and it's part of a larger thing. No one, like there's no painter that defines our time, right? There's no artist that defines like the culture now. And if they are, it's because it's like NFTs or like Beeple. You know, someone who's like, oh, they're famous because they've made so much money and their work sells for so much, and that's why they're famous. They're not famous because their art is uniquely revolutionary in the canon of art.
So is this then a sort of like return to the meta narrative then? Because it seems to me that like a lot of this art of the 21st century, I guess we could maybe call it postmodern art, right? Would that be a fair term to use? Or does that mean something more specific? I guess what I'm sort of thinking about is like, you know, a lot of the art that we see today in the 21st century feels like it is meta in the sense that it's in communication with the idea of like, well, what is art? You know, like art as a commentary on the commodification of art itself, you know, art as sort of like in communication with, you know, questions of the identities of the people that have traditionally made art and sort of like breaking through, you know, different prisms of race and gender and all of this kind of stuff, right? Art that is sort of creatively engaged in a kind of postmodern way with the space of the art gallery, you know, art that's self-consciously commercialized for its own sake, right? Like that to me feels, I suppose in one sense, that's kind of bundle of stuff feels a little postmodern to me, but it also feels like a return to a kind of meta-narrative where these concepts of like commercialism, capitalism, you know, identity and all of that are sort of looming large in a way that what you just described as sort of like the 20th century tradition of art, or sort of being like art for its own sake, has sort of been abandoned.
I would say, I don't know, my opinion on like what postmodernism was.
Yeah.
Like, I think it describes something like this very, like, post-truth, post-conclusion sort of, like, rhizomatic system of opinions, right? But at the end of the day, if you look at, like, the modernist, not the modernist project, because that makes it seem like it was very intentional.
Yes.
The modernism is, like, progress for progress' sake,
yeah,
right? And postmodernism is, like, in service to modernism still, because when art becomes idiosyncratic and when art becomes for its own sake, right? The postmodern narrative of like, okay, what is progress? What are conclusions? What is truth?
Yes.
That's still in service to exploring like new potential futures. It's still in service to like modernism to a sake of like a sense of like psychic, like ideological progress.
Yeah.
Right? So do you follow that?
I guess, but I don't know if I necessarily find that super persuasive, right? Like in the sense that it is championing a certain idea of the future. But I would say that like what seems distinctive is that it's not necessarily championing the idea of the future as a kind of like a positive aspirational goal. Like it feels a little bit less conscious of that, like sort of postmodern art of the sort I'm describing that's very sort of like meta and very hyper self-aware or very sort of cynical and very, you know, kind of critical of the larger kind of like our understanding of what art is and what art has become in the 20th century, right? Like it sort of modern, like, or sort of postmodern art or 21st century art, it feels like there's a kind of aloofness to it that is valued very highly. Whereas like 20th century art, like these people who were making the art felt consciously motivated that they were engaged in something that was sort of like useful in sort of the realm of cultural self-expression. And then thus it's tied into an idea of like, you know, the artist as like the free individual and who's pioneering new things. Whereas today it kind of feels like, yeah, like there's a degree of sort of like nihilism to it and indifference to the future.
Yeah,
in a value sense.
Yeah,
like, yeah,
I would agree with that. I think aloofness is a cynical, aloof. Those are good words to describe it.
They don't seem necessarily like proud of what they're doing. Maybe on some level,
and they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be proud of what they're doing. That's what blackpilled me on in my master's degree. I was like, what the fuck is this for?
Yes.
Like I'm just like I'm not like a kid, drawing in his bedroom anymore. It's just like. It's keep letting back on that. It's just neat.
It's neat.
It's neat. And I ultimately, like, the end goal of anybody in arts right now is to make a fuckload of money. And that's fine. But, like, at the end of the day, you're in the same business as creating NFTs. They're just physical. And they're not, I guess they're not fungible, but it's like, that's what you're doing. You're generating hype. You're generating speculation. You're creating you're trying to enter the market, like a stock or like a startup. That's what art is now. Which is fine, but like admit it. You know, I feel like artists are very scared to admit like what they do is useless.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you talked about this in one of your videos as well, is that in some ways like we're too intelligent about art, or like because there's been so much academia, right? Like the study of art, like to be an art critic, to be critically engaged with art, to understand art at a kind of like high academic philosophical level. Like there's just too much of that now. And so art is often too self-consciously engaged with that sort of side of things.
Yeah.
Right? Like with the, like the quintessential example is, the rambling artist statement that you have to see in every sort of gallery now.
Which is that's brand new.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah,
right?
that's a brand new phenomenon.
But it's also just a kind of symptom of the idea that like art is engaged in these meta-narratives where like art has to very consciously say something that is in communication with sort of the traditions that have come before. And again, like themes of commodification and identity and all these other sort of like high-minded political ideas that we expect to be animating every other aspect of life have to be very self-consciously animating art and the artist's motivation and even the artist's presentation of his art through things like the artist statements.
I know, and it's all just, it's like a smokescreen.
Yeah.
Almost. It's like, this is important, this matters, I can't explain why, but you'll feel like it does. You get the vibe that it matters.
And I guess that's why it's interesting, like, and why I'm encouraged by the idea that you want to talk more about 20th century art, because I guess it's a way to sort of free yourself from all of that and sort of talk about, at a time when maybe art was a little bit less burdened by a sense of itself. The famous Peter Griffin quote,
It insists on itself.
It insists on itself, like a time when art didn't really do that the way that art today does.
That came from Seth MacFarlane had written a essay in film school about The Godfather.
Oh, is that
and
so?
that was one of the comments on like the paper was like, this insists upon itself. And that's where the quote comes from. So the professor
wild.
said it to him.
It's a good line, though.
It is a great line.
It does communicate something about the nature of sort of pretentious stuff. And I guess, I don't know. Like when I was growing up, there was a sort of sense that the modern or that the abstract art was kind of conquering everything, right? And then that was sort of like the rise of, I think, a sense that like art was becoming like being defined by a sort of pretentiousness and like an impenetrability. And that sort of like openly sort of contemptuous of sort of like middle class sensibilities, middle class capacities to sort of comprehend what art was. And I feel like when we talk about things insisting upon themselves, that kind of like conjures up that kind of idea.
Yeah.
Like the idea like this is not for you, it shouldn't be for you, it is primarily for the artist and for a very sort of select group of people that have the sophistication to sort of appreciate it. Whereas I think I know that 20th century art, Jackson Pollock or whoever, faced criticisms of a sort of similar sort. But I don't know, something feels a little bit tangibly different about, I don't know, like a different sort of pretentiousness that's much more self-consciously so.
There's a very famous story of, do you know Philip Guston?
Yeah.
Okay. Just for the audience, he was an abstract expressionist painter. He was colleagues with Jackson Pollock. He was like big in New York in the 50s. Then once that art movement sort of dies, he disappears into obscurity. And then he basically disappeared for 10 years in the 60s and early 70s. And he comes back to New York. He's an older man, and he starts painting like more figurative representational artwork. It's not abstract anymore. It's like the KKK hoods and like the fingers. Like it's all representational. It's like it's imagery. It's not abstract.
Yes.
So he does his first gallery opening, and Jackson Pollock, who's been dead, his wife is there, and his wife breaks down in tears, seeing that he's now moved on to representational. And he was like, "This is the biggest disrespect to my husband you could have ever done. This is like degenerate, disgusting art. How dare you paint representational artwork?"
Wow.
Yeah. And then she left the gallery just like, completely infuriated that he dared to paint anything that looked real rather than abstract. So it's like how seriously these people took these ideas as having value in their own sake. And it wasn't a smokescreen. It wasn't like pretending. It was like they really believed in what they were doing. It's really fascinating.
That is fascinating. Do you think there's people around today that behave like that?
I don't know. It's
like, do you think there are artists today that are like, who take themselves very seriously and are bothered by certain types of art, right?
Yeah.
And what kind of art do you think sort of offends the sensibilities of a lot of the art community now? Is it similar in the sense that like representational art is kind of at the bottom of the hierarchy of what is worth valuing?
I think kitsch.
Yeah.
People who play with kitsch but not knowingly. I mean, I shouldn't say not knowingly. Like Jeff Koons is pretty like in the academic like art school world. Jeff Koons is pretty trounced upon as like they say hotel lobby art.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Which is again like very representational, right?
Yeah. I think that stuff like explicitly. Again, it's like okay, bullshit jobs.
Yeah.
Right, and the whole one of the theories he presents in that book is like, you can have a bullshit job, but you can't say it. You have to hide behind like the smoke screen. You have to hide behind the obfuscating of like what you actually do.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if you're good or bad at your job. All that matters is that you play that role. But the second you start pointing at the fact that what you do is useless, that's when you like lose the position. And I think artists, the art that people don't like now is the art that is like Jeff Koons or like NFTs that are explicitly being like, no, I'm going to make a fuck ton of money off this. I'm not going to pretend that this actually means anything to the grand narrative of art. And that sort of gets, but again, it's like, you know, the banana that was taped to a wall.
Yes.
Why do people know that? Why do people know about that?
Yeah.
It's because it's sold for $400,000.
Yeah.
It's not because there's a banana taped to a wall. That would be like, you know, that could go on anywhere. But the fact that it's sold for so much money is the story. It's the same with, I don't know, any famous piece of artwork, any young artist that comes up, the first thing that comes up about them is, 27-year-old artist sells painting for $2 million. Like, that's the story.
Yes.
The story isn't like how the art is groundbreaking. The story is what it's sold for.
Yes. And that does bother you, right? Like, this was, if I'm recalling correctly, this was a big part of your anti-cause diatribe video, right?
Yeah. No, 100%. It used to bother me. I think it's the way things are now.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna be a curmudgeon about it.
Yeah.
I think, like you said, it's like the end of postmodernism in the sense that like the new meta narrative is like in service to like capital by any means necessary.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't know. It's the way things are. I'm not gonna change the world by fucking yelling about it on the internet.
What does Banksy represent?
I think Banksy goes into the, like I was saying before, like the LARPing, the simulations.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not that what he did was cool. It's that the idea of this man existing was cool, right? It's like, oh, there's this anonymous street artist, and that in itself is a cool Hollywood narrative. What he's doing, like the fucking, like the stencil of like a little girl putting a flower in a gun.
Yes.
Who gives a fuck? Like, that doesn't mean anything. It's like the most overplayed, reductive imagery you could possibly imagine. That's like shit a 14-year-old doodles on their notebook.
Yes.
But it's like the narrative is really cool. The story of this man existing is interesting, and that's all that matters.
Yeah.
So it is like this simulation, this LARPing of like things that used to be like genuine, but now it's like it's a good story.
Yeah. And it's been there hasn't really, like, who was the Chinese artist, Ai Weiwei or something?
Ai Weiwei, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's like a similar sort of artist where it's like the story is a big part of the relevance of the art.
Yeah.
And what sort of intrigues people.
He's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's persecuted and all of this kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have like those kinds of people in as big numbers as I suppose we used to, right? Like that the art celebrity who has a sort of, like a bit of a sort of story to them, a bit of like, they're consciously being, I guess, subversive in some ways, or they're like, they're as part of the art and they're sort of famous for being part of the art as the art itself.
Yeah.
Like you sort of expect the art now, I suppose, to be just subversive by virtue of existing as opposed to being in sort of like part of a sort of like larger narrative about this character who is part of the story. I don't know. And that's, I agree with you. I think that's why Banksy is compelling.
Yeah.
They had a big exhibit of his stuff in Vancouver, and it was just like, I never went to go see it because in some ways, like, I was satiated merely knowing that Banksy was doing an exhibit in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that becomes sort of satisfying unto itself, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It gets at this, again, like the flakiness, right? It gets at this broader question of like, what is worth doing and what is worth knowing, and then trying to pretend like what you're doing is important in some grand sense and not just selfish.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of artists, I don't know. I mean, artists, thinkers, anybody doing something that's not like a tangible STEM or like in politics where it's like you're dealing with material yes and no decisions all the time, and you're dealing with like material research that has objective conclusions. If you're outside of that realm, right, like nothing you're doing is really super important, and it's hard to justify what you're doing as like this grand important thing, whether it's art, whether it's writing, philosophy, literature, right?
Yeah.
And I think you have to make the concession that you're like, I don't know, tell me if this sounds too reductive. I feel like there's like there's like entertainers. There's like 3 types of jobs. Okay. There's like maintenance, entertainment, and science.
Okay.
Right? In the sense that like the maintenance guy like maintains the system, the entertainer is like, famous or important in his own right for being like a thing to ogle at, and the scientist is coming to conclusions that are objective. And like all jobs, I feel like, like policy fits into the science thing.
Yes.
In the same way like mathematics does. And then like YouTube, artist, performer, anything that's sort of creatively directed fits in the entertainer archetype. And then maintenance is just like, you're at an office or like you're a literal janitor.
Yeah.
You're
just
doing
a retail clerk or a bureaucrat or
it's all
who
maintenance.
drives a taxi, it's all, it seems like it. I'm sure the viewer will be able to find some exceptions to this, but
definitely.
On first glance, it seems, and it is interesting because, the entertainer side of the economy it seems to be growing, right? Like it seems like it's just the barriers to entry into being an entertainer as your profession just seems like it's never been easier because of the internet and, Patreon and all of these other sorts of things that allow for a sort of viable business model, YouTube, social media, all of that, which I think is interesting because I do think it suggests that sort of in a wealthy, industrialized, free country, there will be a directional sort of shift towards entertainment being a larger and larger part of, life, right? This is actually always, it goes back to even, people 100 years ago when they were sort of positing what it would be like to live in a sort of utopian society. It would be that, society would be very much dominated by activities of leisure, right? And I think actually that's why some of the stuff with AI feels uniquely threatening, right? Because exactly at the time when we seem to be pivoting into a much more sort of like leisure-based economy, we have the computers that are theoretically taking those jobs away from us, right? We were prepared for a world in which, the computers would take away the maintenance jobs and thus allow more people to be in sort of the leisure economic or entertainment sort of side of the economy. But the idea that, I'm sure there was like some famous line about this, like that the machines were supposed to, clean the streets and let us write poetry, but instead the machines are writing poetry and we have to clean the streets. Like, I think that's a little reductive, but I think that there's a sort of anxiety that kind of comes from the idea that the part of a career path that I think a lot of people were excited to be a part of now feels like it might become much more difficult to enter.
Yeah.
Do you feel that at all? Like, do you feel? I mean, art and AI is such a rich topic these days, right? But do you feel like it is? Like, what is your basic take on the degree to which it is legitimately threatening to the idea of what I was describing before, the ability to have an artistic career and to be, to be sort of self-sufficient with a career in the artistic realm?
It does feel, I don't know, I put a lot of faith in the fact that the value add of something like a video essay or a work of art to the audience's life is the fact that it was made by somebody with like an individualistic worldview.
Yes.
And you're getting, unless you're like super, I don't know, if you're super credulous and you're taking everything as like, as scripture, right? If you're like looking at like, oh, what is this person, like that's what I think like, I like to think my audience looks at. They're like, oh, what does like Brogan think about this? Right. And that's it. Full stop. Like that's the value add I have. When I like write my videos, I use Perplexity. I use things that are like, help me like do research, help me find sources. I'll be like, okay, find me like 5 books or find me like an essay on this topic and I can like go through it, find me like a study. And then sometimes, I'll be like, write, like just, I want to see what it does. Like write the essay.
Yes.
Or like explain this like system and quote, 9 different continental postmodern philosophers and make it as like academic as and dense as possible. And it does like an amazing job. Yes. You read it and you're like, fuck, this could be like this could be like one of like Derrida's works or something.
Yes.
So I'm like, wait, what am I actually like? What am I doing that is unique when it's like all of my ideas? If I just plug in like draw a connection between capitalism and fucking anime. Yes. Right. And the West, and then throw the fall of the Berlin Wall in there, and then quote Derrida, and then like it does it. I'm like, that's basically what I'm doing, but with the added step of having to research everything. Yeah, I wouldn't make that exact video, but you know what I mean, right? Yeah. So I think people should be rightfully scared of, or it should call into question at least like what value am I proposing with my work? Yes, right. Is it just writing a 5-hour synopsis on iCarly? An AI could do a pretty good job of that. So I don't know, man.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm struggling with that a lot as well because, like, just as I guess aesthetic matter, I do like just like fact-based summaries of things. Yeah. Like, I like making videos that just like tell a story and just are a product of the research and the writing or the books that I've read and all that. But at the same time, like, yeah, you're right. Like on some level, it is sort of humbling and worth grappling with the degree to which maybe that kind of content is not a very sort of sophisticated thing to be producing. Like maybe it is something that a machine can do, and not because a machine is like so clever and sophisticated, but because, when you break it down to its component parts of just like extracting facts and then just kind of like weaving them together with a few, expository sentences, like maybe that is a very sort of like workman-like task, as opposed to something that is a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more literary, a little bit more personal, a little bit more reflective of the human experience. And so that is something that I'm trying to get better at and trying to put more of in my videos, even if it's just like sharing more anecdotes, like personal anecdotes. That's something that I try to do a little bit more. Like if I'm telling, particularly if I'm telling about like a recent history, that I sort of sprinkle it with like, well, this is my memory of what that was like. Or I remember when I was a kid, this was considered a big deal, or my parents had this to say, or like I had a friend that was really into this or that, right? To kind of just bring it back to the fact that we are ultimately human beings and that this stuff is worth knowing because it actually affects the human realm, right? Like it's not just stuff that exists so we can put a bunch of facts on a page of paper or in a video. It's so that we can have a sort of deeper understanding of humanity and the human condition and what it is to live in, this part of the world and this civilization at this present moment in time. So I think just being a little bit more self-aware of that kind of stuff, which is definitely something a machine can never do.
Yeah.
Because the machine does not have experiences and families and all the rest of that. So
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, for your own sake too, you have to, like, what I do is fun for me. I think when you get into this, you imagine that you're this, I don't know, maybe you've been in it so much longer, so maybe not you, but you imagine that you're like touching on something very, very important, and everyone who's watching what you're doing is like glued to the screen.
Yes.
At the end of the day, people are gonna listen to this podcast on the fucking way to work. people watch my video like as they're eating cereal.
Yes.
Crunch,
the loud crunch of the crunch berries drowning out every second word.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I just, I get thrown on a monitor when like the video comes out. They're like, oh, I kind of like this guy.
Yes.
I'll put it on, walk around and fucking vacuum.
Yes.
I like doing it. Right. And it's fine. I think that's a good reason. That's a good reason as any, is that you like doing it and it's stimulating to you and it feels meaningful to you. And that's it. I think if you just keep asking yourself, not that you do this, but maybe more so for me, if you keep asking yourself like, am I doing something important? You're not going to find an answer. I think there's very few important things to do, right? I think I've had this in my head forever, but like the opening the Schindler's List?
Yeah.
Have I talked to this before?
No, is this a Brogan...
This is my heuristic. This is my sorting algorithm.
Okay.
Is the opening the Schindler's List.
Okay.
When they have the 3 desks. And they're like, what do you do? And he's like, I'm a factory worker. Like, go on that line.
Yes.
And they're like, what do you do? And the next guy, he's like, I'm a violinist. And then you're like, oh, go to that line. It's the line where they just kill you immediately.
Yes.
They're like, go to that line. And then the guy has to run up. He's like, no. He's also a factory worker to save his life. You know? I think, trying to continually sort yourself into the realm where like what you're doing is like really consequential is it's hard. There's very few important things except for like, can you work with your hands? Can you like, are you a heart surgeon? Are you a firefighter? Those are important. But at the end of the day, if it's Nazi Germany and it's me, the video essayist, and the firefighter up against the wall, I know who's dying first.
Yeah, no, I suppose when you put it like that, Brogan, when you define the stakes to be quite that high, I mean, maybe it's true. Like, I guess the way that I think about it is like, I want to be useful to other people. And I do think that we live in a very complex, very information-dense society in which your ability to sort of navigate this complex world of ours is really a matter of your ability to master information, to be literate, to be knowledgeable, to be able to communicate. Like communication and communicate information to other literate people is, I think, the kind of the essence of what it is to be a fully actualized, realized, competent person who can, fulfill their dreams and ambitions in this society of ours. So, I don't know, in my own small way, that's kind of like what keeps me going, is that I'm trying to be useful and trying to help people, just gain a little bit more useful fact-based knowledge that can help them sort of navigate a very complicated world and feel a little bit less intimidated by it. Because it was like what we were talking about before, right? Where, when people are ignorant, they are often insecure. And when people are insecure, they often become easy marks for like crazy conspiracy theories that, wind up supporting destructive authoritarian governments that, trample over the human rights of the individual and all sorts of other bad things. So I don't know. In my own small way, I'm trying to help sort of inoculate people against those sorts of temptations by making them maybe feel a little bit more self-confident and a little bit more, I don't know, like seduced by the pursuit of fact-based knowledge. There was a quote that I always liked, which was from the memoir of Nathaniel Braden, who was a acolyte of Ayn Rand, and he ultimately turned against her. And the line that he had near the end of his memoir that always sort of stuck with me is that he said, we were valuing the ownership of truth over the pursuit of truth. And I feel like that's sort of something that I try to live my life according to, is, you try to be humble and modest and understand that like truth is kind of like forever out of our grasp, but we should forever be engaged in a sort of project of seeking to obtain truth. Small truths, little bits here and there, they ultimately add up to something, but we'll never be in a pure state of ownership of truth.
Yeah.
And when people believe they themselves to be, I think, that's often actually a mask for a deeper sort of insecurity about their own ignorance.
It's a good point. I believe that, just plucking away microscopically at making the world a better place, believing that you're doing the best you can.
Yeah, and then just like you're gradually getting a little bit more intelligent and literate, and so too is the audience, and we're all engaged on this project together. And I feel that way about like just interpersonal relationships, right? Like, am I with somebody who is sort of modest enough to understand that they are limited and flawed and are trying to correct themselves and trying to get a little bit smarter every day, a little bit better at the things that they care about, versus people that are just kind of like cocky and arrogant and just sort of sit back and think they've got it all figured out. And, so I don't know. It's as I've gotten older, it's just life becomes so much more intimidating. And the fact that like, I actually feel like much more kind of uncertain than I think I did when I was in my 20s, which like logically follows on some level. But sometimes it gets really kind of like actually like existentially terrifying, where it's like I start to like just second guess everything that I think I know, because I just realize there's just so much more to know than I'll ever be able to know in one lifetime. Yeah. And I'm just like, well, the things I actually know, like how much do I actually know them? How confident am I really? And I get more kind of like nervous and uncertain. And that can be kind of scary. And so there becomes actually an impulse that I feel I have to fight against as I get older, which is to just kind of like retreat, right? Like to just become the kind of like the hermit, where it's just like, well, maybe if I could just like make my one little painting or something, right? Like maybe that's all I should aspire to do, because I'm just such a just kind of like flawed person that cannot rise to the level of knowledge that our society expects, and you get very sort of impressed and humbled by people that just seem so hyper confident and so in command of facts, and their knowledge is so vast and wide ranging, and you just start to think like, wow, I'm already 41 years old, and to aspire to that just seems impossible, so like why bother? But I don't know, I don't allow myself to get that sort of down in the dumps too often.
Yeah, I mean, that Viktor Frankl quote,
which
it's like, if you take man as he is, he'll fall and miss. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
So if you take man as he is, he'll fall and miss the mark. If you expect the best of man, he'll become what he can be. Right? But you still always fail. But like, if you expect the best of yourself, you'll end up higher than you would have been if you just kind of conceded and retreated and accepted that you know nothing. So I don't know.
Expecting the best is, I think, a good standard.
That's why I'm religious. That's why I believe in Jesus.
Yeah,
he's the best guy to ever exist.
Yeah,
he's narrative perfection. He's like the highest ideal you could possibly achieve. And if you align yourself with Jesus, you'll end up being a better person than you would have been.
And I guess the idea of like trying to please God and to be, the kind of person that God expects you to be, like that's a good impulse to have, right? In the same way that you want parents that have, standards for you. You want like mentors and sort of other figures in your life that have standards for you. You want to feel, I think it's good to feel the pressure of disappointment, of like feeling like that you have the capacity to disappoint someone, above you, that loves you and has high standards for what you're capable of doing, as opposed to just living entirely for yourself and defining success and achievement entirely on your own terms. Yeah, no, I think there's definitely something to that for sure.